We tend to believe that the best architects have the best designs, but this is not always the case. There are thousands of architects out there with great ideas that don't become famous, or even worse, that don't even get to build what they design. Just look at architecture students' portfolio, it is full of good concepts that we will never see in the real world. So the question here is why? Why only few architects are going to make it to the top and being able to see their projects becoming a reality? And Bjarke Ingels is one of the lucky ones. But in reality, luck has really little to do with his success, and like other famous architects, we attribute his success to his design only. But Bjarke understands that even the best concepts in the world aren't enough by themselves. In other words, architecture is more than just architecture. Because he knows he not only needs his architecture to be great, but the way he presents it also. So I decided to analyze Bjarke's presentation, and after watching hours of videos, I think I can tell you what makes Bjarke's projects so appealing to the client or the jury he wants to convince. So it's actually not even complicated. It is one of these techniques that people don't do because they don't know about it, but the truth is that everyone can do it, and you just need to know the right way to present your projects. You know, we often hear that 90% of people's communication goes through what we call the non-verbal communication. More important than just the words you chose, it's the gesture you make and the tone of voice you use that play a huge role in your daily conversation. In other words, it's not what you say that matters, it is how you say it. And I wouldn't be surprised to hear that 90% of architects' success isn't about the design itself, but the way they are presenting their ideas. And Bjarke Ingels is one of the best examples that you can find out there that shows that even as a famous architect, he takes his project's presentation very seriously, probably working for weeks in order to find the most efficient way to deliver his message. So it's why I want to analyze with you the way he presents his concept and what we can learn from it, because I do believe that he found the perfect presentation strategy that makes his concept and architecture easy to understand, remarkable and rememberable. So in order to do that, I want to show you and take you to a journey to the presentation he gave for what is one of his most important projects in his career so far, at least in terms of budget. It's a $335 million project in New York that Bjarke called the Big U. This architectural competition came right after Hurricane Sandy devastated the city in 2012, and so New York was looking for ways to protect the city from further flooding, and Bjarke decided to participate. But this project was very specific, not only by its size and the importance for the city, but by the way the government approached it. Because basically the government wanted the architectural firms to work with the community stakeholders that were and would be impacted by the future floodings. And this wasn't just a suggestion, it was mandatory. They even forced the design teams to engage in 3 months of research, traveling the region to meet the stakeholders and learn from the people affected by the hurricane. All of this before to start any drawing. And you'll see in his presentation that Bjarke knew very well how important it was to involve the city into his creative process. He understood that the more the city would be involved, the more credibility he would have in order to prove his ideas to be right. But first, as in all good presentation, we need to start with a problem. Why do we need a building for, and why do we need an architect for? And it sounds pretty logical saying it, but I rarely see people starting their presentation defining the problem they want to solve. And I find this pretty sad because it's very important for you to remind your client that you understand his or her needs, the problem you want to solve. It's going to reassure him or her knowing that you guys have the same vision. So I would recommend you to start your presentation like Bjarke, taking some time introducing the environment in which the project takes place and redefining the problem you are going to solve. And for those of you who have watched my previous video on how to make your ideas look like an Hollywood blockbuster, you will recognize Act 1, which is the setup of the environment and defining the goal of the story. But here, even more than just a setup, Bjarke wants his audience to understand that he has a deep understanding of the problem he was asked to solve.
We met like a bit more than 2 years ago. Sandy hit New York and caused a lot of devastation. It wiped out all of Lower Manhattan. And essentially, like suddenly the Sandy happened because the sort of Atlantic hurricane belt is expanding because of rising temperatures. And because of the geometry of the New York Bight, you have this sort of 90-degree funnel shape. Like all of this sort of storm surge is sort of channeled into the most densely populated region in all of America, putting 50% of New York at risk. And if you look at this map of Lower Manhattan, you can see since the 17th century we've been expanding Manhattan through landfill. And this landfill is exactly the area that is now flood prone. So you can say the areas that we have been responsible for creating are also the ones where we need to take greater responsibility in protecting them.
So you see that he took the problem very seriously. He doesn't even look like an architect in the first part of this presentation. He looks more like a scientist that's giving you a lecture about why we should improve the resilience of the city of New York. And this is what I mean by acknowledging the problem you're trying to solve. Basically, it shows that you did your homework. You learned about the city, you learned about the problem, about the people living there. And the thing is that I'm sure most of you already do some research for your project, so don't be afraid to talk about it. And if we take Bjarke's case, he was forced by the jury to study and analyze the problem during 3 months. So it proves how important it can be for a client that you show them that you understand the problem you're trying to solve. And you don't have to wait until you're forced to do it. You can do it proactively and talk about it. It's going to create a perfect foundations to build your own credibility. It shows that you know what you are talking about. So then, once you've done that, you can introduce the goal, the question you were asked to answer. And here the obvious objective was to find a way, any way, to protect the city of New York from flooding again. But Bjarke is smarter than that. Look how he's reframing the question by showing that protecting the city is good, but doing it in a nice looking way is better.
So the question is like, how can you protect all of Lower Manhattan without creating this seawall that segregates the life of the city from the water around it?
So this is very smart, because as I said, the initial question was to find a way to protect the city. It was a pretty open question, but Bjarke knew that the jury would have this hidden fear to have no other choice than end up with a non-aesthetic concrete structure surrounding the city that we usually see for these types of projects. So by defining this hiding fear, Bjarke basically says we're not only wondering how we can save the city from flooding, but how we can do it in a smart and elegant way. So Bjarke is reassuring the jury by reframing the question, showing them that he understands their deepest need. And this technique is very subtle, yet it is very powerful, because it puts this project on top of everyone else that didn't take in consideration this question, how to make it useful and beautiful. And now we want to know what Bjarke came up with, since he promised us something unusual. And this is the other reason you should reframe the question, because it gives you the opportunity to create a sense of mystery around your project, therefore grabbing people's attention by saying, I have a solution to your deepest problem, so stay with me. And we as viewers are hooked into his presentation, and we are now looking forward to see and to learn about his concept. And it looks like it's a perfect time to do so. It's a perfect time to introduce the main idea, but not for Bjarke. Bjarke wants to take his time, and he wants to show that his concept and the idea he came up with is actually not his. It's 100% inspired by the city itself, in a sense that his ideas are only made of proven concepts from New York that he collected and gathered. Look.
And we thought maybe we could learn a little bit from the High Line. The High Line is a piece of decommissioned infrastructure that has now turned into one of the most popular promenades in New York City. And we were thinking, like, what if you can actually, instead of waiting for the infrastructure to get decommissioned before you add the program, what if you could actually think of the resilience infrastructure for Manhattan as sort of the dry line, to imagine it that it comes from day one with a lot of extra sort of positive social and environmental side effects.
So this is very interesting because he's bringing the audience into his creative journey and is almost showing us the behind the scene of an architect idea, and people always like to see the things we are not supposed to. But what's even more powerful here is that before even showing his concept, he's literally saying, if you like the eyeline, you are going to like my project. Very simple. And I personally lived in New York, and I can tell you that it is hard to find someone that doesn't like this place. It's the place to go to if you live in the city. So who wouldn't want another eyeline? So taking the success of this project and applying it to your own is very smart. And he's not even hiding it, because first he's talking about it, he admits that it was part of his inspiration, and he even calls his project the dry line as a logical follow-up of this famous piece of infrastructure. And this is something that you should do also if you can. You just need to find the right building or infrastructure to connect your concept with. It's going to be seen as a proof that your idea is a good one. And you probably need that, because when people are facing things that they aren't familiar with, like new architectural concepts, they tend to avoid it. You need the same reason you always end up going to the same restaurant, or the same reason people end up going on vacation to the same country or city. The risk of trying something new is too high compared to what we know has been proven and works well for us already. So by showing that your concept is actually not completely new, that it is based on something that's working already, you're going to reassure the jury or the client and make them more open to your ideas. And Bjarke knows that. He knows that so well that he's literally applying the same techniques 5 seconds after, taking the best of the city of New York and applying it to his own project. Let's watch this.
On its own. And then when you look at the sort of urban development of New York, it's characterized by this David and Goliath encounter between Robert Moses, aka the power broker, and Jane Jacobs. Robert Moses, he did a lot of the necessary infrastructural investments of Manhattan, like a lot of the highways on the waterfronts, a lot of the social housing projects. But they were very, very top down, and they were like rarely very sort of instantly successful. They often like cut the people off from like different neighborhoods, got cut off from each other, or like you couldn't reach the water. And one day he tried to cut a highway through Greenwich Village, and he met Jane Jacobs, who mounted this grassroots opposition. And eventually she defeated the plan, and Greenwich Village is still there. But we thought, in this case, it could be interesting to think of this resilience infrastructure as the love child of Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs. Because, to provide, 8 contiguous miles of waterfront protections, you need holistic, big picture perspective, but it needs to happen rooted in the local communities. And
how smart is this? Because he hasn't shown his concept yet, it's coming, but it feels like he's the perfect guy for this specific project. And this feeling comes from the fact that he shows the audience, he shows you that he knows the city. He's not an outsider, and he do know the city he wants to build in. And Bjarke does it first by introducing a general example like the eyeline, but why he felt like the need to add a second example is because he doesn't want to show that he only knows the eyeline. This actually doesn't make him original enough. Anyone visiting New York once knows about it. So he went a step further and used details from the city's urban planning history that only few people know about. But guess who belongs to this list of few people knowing about the history of urban planning in New York? The jury members, of course. Just to remind you, this project is 10 miles long surrounding Manhattan, and it's going to reshape the city probably like no other projects since decades. So of course, urban planners from the city have something to say about this project, and they will be part of the jury. So these guys are very familiar with the story of Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs. It's probably one of the first things you have to learn if you want to become an urban planner in New York. But the danger of using past experience fame, like Bjarke did, is that there's a risk that one of the jury members doesn't like the reference you're taking. Just imagine, You're taking as an example a famous architect, and one of the jury member client hates him. It's not going to be good for you. And it could have happened with Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs, who are pretty extremist in their ideas. But it's where Bjarke's presentation is a case study that should be shown in every architectural school, because it always anticipates every possible opposition. And here he couldn't know if the jury was more in favor of Robert Moses' heritage or Jane Jacobs. So he came up with this brilliant idea, which is we took the best of both persons. So it doesn't frustrate any jury member, and more important, it shows that Bjarke is someone pragmatic, not idealistic, that is always trying to find the best solution for his client's problem, and this is very nice to hear from a client perspective. But now it's time to show the final concept. He still has our attention, and it is where all the credibility he acquired during the first part of his presentation is going to improve the perception we have about his project. Look.
Communities. And essentially the main challenge is to resist a certain amount of storm surge, you need a certain geometry. But this geometry could be made in so many different ways, so that when you go there, you won't notice that this is actually part of a dam. It could be like a piece of landscape that also becomes what protects the city from flooding. It could be like various artworks, or like almost like furniture, landscaping. You could imagine like the median of the West Side Highway could become this art piece that also sort of protects the city from flooding.
And as he promised earlier, he didn't build a wall, and he did build a second eye line. And so the purpose of his introduction now makes sense, because you have no other options than to agree that this is a cool project, since every objections possible have been answered along the first part of his introduction. And this is even smarter than answering objection after showing your concept, because you don't let the opportunity for people to even think of ways to criticize your project. So now that we saw the overall idea, we want to know more. Since the project is 10 miles long and crossing different neighborhoods, we want to know if Bjarke really thought about every single details or only about the big picture. And in order to show that he thought about every single details, he's going to zoom in on the neighborhood that needs this project the most. And look how he's going to use exactly the same structure we analyzed so far. First, acknowledging the problem you're trying to solve. In this case, how to make the city more flood resistant. Second, show that you know the city. Third, have your ideas coming from the city itself. And finally, show the result of this process.
Further, we went to the Lower East Side. Lower East Side was like really massively hit by Sandy. These are the areas that got flooded. And when you look at the 100-year flood and the 500-year flood, actually 2/3 of this neighborhood is flood threatened. It's a primarily residential neighborhood, and this is actually a map of all of the public housing or the affordable housing on Lower Manhattan. It's all inside this neighborhood. It's also the most ethnically diverse neighborhood. It's the most socially challenged neighborhood. It's like rather underserviced by public transportation, but in return it has a highway cutting it off from the waterfront. And even though it appears green, it actually has a lot less park than any other neighborhood in Manhattan. 95% of the surface is impervious, which also makes it more flood prone. And when you walk down the waterfront, you can see that it's like tortured by this sort of relationship to the infrastructure. So we sort of created this process where we sort of reached out to the local community. We had a series of workshops with the people from the Lower East Side, trying to test different ideas. We made this sort of smorgasbord of different solutions, and together we formulated a series of strategies. So one idea was in the East River Park, simply to create, raise the ground of the park to protect the park from the noise of the highway and also protect the city from flooding. It could be a phase 1 of a phase 2 to eventually submerge the park and integrate a new subway line underneath it.
Same structure for presenting his ideas and still very effective. And you notice that there's nothing magical about it. Anyone can do it and have the same result, which is a smooth story, yet very persuasive. And you noticed that the inspiration from the city itself can come from different approaches. It can be an actual piece of infrastructure or building, like the High Line. It can take its roots into the history of the city itself, or even asking the users themselves, in this case, the citizen of the neighborhood in which the project takes place. And Bjarke likes, I could say love, to make the users of the place participate into his creative process. And he used this concept to an extreme in his own country when the city of Copenhagen asked him to redesign one of the biggest urban space in the city. Look.
We did an urban space in Copenhagen, and it's in the most ethnically diverse neighborhood in all of Denmark. It consists of what we call the Red Square, the Black Market, and the Green Park. And you have 60 different nationalities living here, so the importance of the project was really to involve the local community and create a sense of ownership. So we got this idea that it would be strange if the Danes had done the best bench and the best trash bin and the best lamppost. So we reached out to the local community through different media and through meetings and had people recommend elements from their other home country. And the basic idea is that we don't eat Chinese food to be nice to the Chinese. It's because we crave Beijing duck or noodles or dumplings. And we didn't put a Moroccan fountain in the middle of Copenhagen to be nice to the Moroccans, but because they have an amazing heritage of architectural water features. So you have a Jamaican sound system. The neighbors hate it. A Thai boxing arena. You have Iraqi swings, litter boxes from Great Britain, bollards from Ghana, like bicycle racks from Finland. The sign on the Red Square is actually a sign from the Red Square. You have like an amazing Kazakh bus stop, way cooler than a typical Danish one. We found palm trees in China that actually grow in a Danish climate. This octopus like really sort of reveals the diversity of the neighborhood.
So this is something you can use for your own project, and I personally try to do that as much as I can for the project I'm working on. So maybe not base your whole concept on the users, even though it worked for Bjarke in Copenhagen, but get inspired by the users of your future project. It not only makes sense from a practical point of view, but it also makes sense for the jury or the client, because who knows best what they want than the users themselves. And Bjarke knows that by taking the credibility of his users, he's adding value to his own project, and it's why he tries to implement this idea in all the public projects he designs, like the Big U. And let's go back to this project, because it's the last part, the conclusion, that is crucial in order to end your presentation in the most impactful way. So remember that we started this creative journey with a problem. The problem that New York is at risk when it comes to flooding. So it's always good to end up your presentation reminding people that you indeed solved the problem the jury was looking for. And it's even more important for Bjarke, who kind of focused our attention on his original concept and all the cool elements he added to it, which somehow shifted our attention away from the main reason this project was created for. So Bjarke needs to remind us that his project has cool urban features indeed, but it is also going to save the city from further flooding. And Bjarke knows the importance of a good conclusion as much as a good introduction. And it's why instead of just saying, by the way, remember that my project is flood-proof, he was more original and used several examples of his urban elements and showing them in both the fun way and the flood-proof way that remind us that it's going to save the city.
You know, normally you just look up and you have like local artists and, you know, it illuminates and make the underside more friendly. And then, you know, some of them can flip down and create temporary enclosures for like a Christmas market, or they can become what saves the city. Some places, all you need is actually 4 feet of height to resist the 50-year floodplain. So they can be like undulating benches serving different activities. And then they also becomes what saves the city. And they can serve as sockets for bigger flood barriers when you have a 100-year or a 500-year flood coming. Further down, we're proposing to create these little pavilions that animate the space underneath the canopy of the highway. So like galleries and markets that sort of make the underside more friendly and lively, but also protects the city from flooding. They're placed so that we never block the view from the side streets coming down to the water, so you always look uninterrupted down to the water, but then you have these like sliding walls that can come out and actually stop a flood from coming in.
And this is how you end a presentation, answering the question you introduced at the beginning. And as we saw earlier, Bjarke told us that the question he was going to answer was the following.
So the question is like, how can you protect all of Lower Manhattan without creating this seawall that segregates the life of the city from the water around it?
So he clearly delivered what he promised us. And there is this famous quote from writers that really sum up what we just saw and sum up the mindset you should have from the introduction to the conclusion. And the quote says, "Every good beginning has a little bit of the end in it. Therefore, every good ending has a little bit of the beginning in it." And I do believe this to be true if you want your presentation to be interesting, therefore grabbing and keeping people's attention all along. You cannot just randomly present your project and hope that it's going to interest them. It doesn't work that way. You only need the right structure, and in Bjarke's example, it's not even difficult as we saw. It only takes 4 steps. And first, it's acknowledging the problem. This is the first piece of credibility you're bringing to your presentation. Second, show that you know the city. Maybe you're born there, maybe you've built buildings there, or whatever connection you can find. Third, you can talk about your inspiration. What did you take from the city? And I would say that this one is not mandatory because you might not find any links, but try to use it whenever it's possible, mostly for public projects, because usually for public projects the city lacks to have symbols. And it's why Bjarke asked the citizens from the neighborhood in which a project is going to take place to help him design the project, because this is going to be a great symbol for the city itself and they'll be proud of this. Then logically the fourth part is to finally show your concept using the previous points. So I'm not saying that this is the best and only way you can present your project, but there's really interesting component from this structure that you can grab. And why I'm saying that is because this presentation and persuasion techniques are actually based on universals, and that's why it's so interesting to analyze them. And how do you know that something is universal? Is by looking what was true 1,000 years ago and what is still true today. And one of the best examples for this theory are the Greek philosophers. Their ideas have survived the test of time, probably more than any other ideas in history. And what we might forget is that they gave us the best and easiest persuasion technique you can use, and it is actually the same techniques and same principles that he used in his presentation. So 1,000 years ago, Aristotle developed a theory about the art of persuasion, and he believed that any persuasive arguments relied on 3 pillars, which is ethos, logos, and pathos. It's quick, we'll get into the detail of this. And he believes that if you were missing any of this or deficient in one of these, you wouldn't be able to persuade. Nobody would listen to you or care about what you have to say. So it's really important and very true, as you'll see. And the first pillar is ethos, and ethos means credibility. Aristotle stated that it doesn't matter how well reasoned or logical an argument is if the audience doesn't trust the person who's delivering the message. And this is why Bjarke started his presentation by building its credibility to work on this project way before showing his concept. He did that by saying, I understand very well the flooding problem and I understand very well the city. Plus, he didn't start his presentation already from scratch since he was known as a famous architect. So all of these elements of credibility made him look very capable for this specific project. So we can say that he has ethos. The second pillar is logos, and logos means logic. For example, if you state that your project is going to improve people's life, it's not enough. As true as that statement might be, you have to show the logical reasoning behind your statement and why that particular design is useful and beneficial for the final users. You can't just simply tell people that your product is awesome. You have to be able to show it and prove it. And Bjarke does use logical arguments. First, by stating that he has a proof that his concept is going to work. It's the case when he's talking about the eyeline, for example. And second, when he's showing his overall concept, you can clearly see that his infrastructure is flood proof. So Bjarke do use logical arguments. And the last pillar is pathos. And pathos is the appeal of emotion. And Aristotle stated that you cannot only persuade people by using logical arguments. You have to use emotion, whether it's anger, love, humor. You have to connect your message to an emotion in order to be more persuasive. And in our case, Bjarke was very smart because throughout his presentation he used two emotions that were on both sides of the spectrum. The first emotion was fear, the fear of another flooding in New York that everyone knows would happen eventually. But he answered this feeling with joy. The joy is gonna bring to the city with all the new human elements and the joy to be living in a city that is not flood threatened. So he inserts these emotions in his story, in the word he uses, but also with the picture it shows. The pictures that illustrate the fear are very dark. You can feel the danger of a flood. In contrast with the bright color it shows for the pictures of his concept, you can already feel, in a sense, life without Bjarke's project and life with Bjarke's concept. So I think now you understand what I mean by architecture is more than just architecture. A great idea alone will never be enough. Just imagine, Bjarke is one of the most famous, if not the most famous architect alive. He is also one of the best, of course, and he came up with this amazing concept that is using urban elements in order to create an infrastructure that's going to save the city from future flooding. So everything was great, and he still worked a lot on his storytelling and on the way he presented his idea. You know, it's like nice looking celebrities. When they go to public events, they're still trying to look nicer than what they naturally are. Putting some makeup, doing their hair and wearing nice clothes. It's the same thing here. Put some makeup on your project. You know, a good presentation is worth as much as a good project, even in architecture. So don't hesitate to take the time and energy into preparing what you want to say and how you want to say it. You know, there's a reason why the best architects spend a lot of time preparing word by word what they want to say. They don't always have the best concepts, but they always have the best presentation. So learn from them and you're going to increase by far your chances of success. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video interesting, and I personally really like making this video about Bjarke because he's always a great guy you can learn from, even when we're not talking about design and architecture, when we're just talking about marketing and presentation. So for sure I'm going to make more videos about him, and if you want to see it, please subscribe, give him a like so it shows me that you want more of this kind of videos.